Welcome to Spotlight. I'm your host, Amitha. Join us weekly to get inspired by success stories and transformational events. Our guest today is a community leader, a voice for his community as Member of Parliament for the Alberta riding of Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, and as Deputy Shadow Minister of Foreign Affairs of the official opposition. It's my pleasure to welcome to our show the Honourable MP Garnett Genuis. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Amitha. It's great to be with you today.
So I know you have a busy schedule, and we are so excited to find out more about what you do for your riding. But before we get to that, tell us a little bit more about yourself, your upbringing, your education.
Sure, yeah. That's great. So I grew up in the riding I represent in Sherwood Park in Alberta, and was deeply influenced growing up by my parents and my grandparents to appreciate the importance of political involvement. In particular, my maternal grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. She was living as a child with Jewish background in Germany during the Second World War. She wasn't able to finish her education. Many of her family members were killed. She spent part of the war hiding out on farms, and she was able to survive because of the vocal anti-Nazi criticism of some people in the area, and of course the fact that politicians in the West saw the need to stand up against Nazism and ultimately to liberate her. So these stories, these impressions gave all of us the impression of just the importance of political involvement. And it wasn't a matter of, do you like politics or not? It was just a matter of, this is something important for you to be engaged in as a citizen, and maybe perhaps even in a full-time way. My grandfather was an engineer who was working in Alberta during the National Energy Program, which was an economic policy of the last Trudeau government that had devastating impacts on our province's economy. And it's interesting how now in my career as a parliamentarian, I see how similar issues come up where, again, we're dealing with questions of international human rights and the extent to which Canada will be engaged with that. And when I see things going on around the world and how it impacts different people, I think about my grandmother and the situation she was in, and I think of the power I have now to try and influence the dynamic of people like her, given the platform I have. And we're dealing with similar issues to what my grandfather dealt with in terms of policies from the national government that are bad for, I would argue, bad for the whole economy of the country, but in particular for the energy sector in my province. So that was kind of my early stage political education, and I became involved as a young person. I became interested and started my studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. Was able, through my involvement there, to get an internship in the office of then Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Worked on Parliament Hill for a couple of years, and did a master's overseas in London at London School of Economics, which kind of really deepened my interest in international affairs. The master's itself was in public policy and philosophy, but the exposure I was able to have to different issues, different ways of thinking. I was in London at the time of the Arab Spring, and so discussions around the Middle East democratization, the impacts of public movement seeking political change, and maybe sometimes their failure to deliver on the promise is all part of the background that shaped my interest and brought me to where I am right now and the work that I'm able to do.
That's amazing. I mean, it's great that you already knew your path early on in life. And were there any challenges along the way to take up this path, or knew for sure that's the only path you wanted to take, and you had support around you? Well,
I mean, there's always obstacles, right? So the first time I ran for office, I lost. I ran provincially in Alberta for a provincial party called the Wild Rose Party that no longer exists, has since been merged to form the United Conservative Party. And so that was a good example of a setback. I like to tell people that I've lost more elections than I've won, certainly if you count my totally unsuccessful forays into undergraduate student union politics. But you learn things along the way. I think it's Churchill who said, success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. So these setbacks didn't really deter me fundamentally, but they were always good learning experiences. You learn much more from the defeats than you do from the successes.
Well said. So since you have taken office now, what are some of the projects that you have been successful in executing in your riding?
Well, it's interesting coming in as an opposition member of parliament because you have certain tools available for raising the profile of issues and putting proposals forward, and at the same time you have limitations. The majority of seats are held by the government, and there's a lot of things maybe you'd like to do that you can't. So I'm looking at the next election, hopeful that our party will be in government, will be able to implement some of the changes in a more direct way. But we've been a strong, effective opposition, and I've been part of that, and I think we've been able to have an impact on certain things. Very early on in my career, we had the issue of euthanasia being debated, and I was able to get 3 amendments to the legislation passed. It was, I proposed over a dozen, but we got 3 of them passed, and I've I think been able to have some success highlighting the plight of the Rohingya and the genocide around targeting Rohingya in Burma, and increase Canadian awareness and response to that to some extent. In terms of my riding, I mentioned the energy sector is very important, and I, not in an isolated way, but working with my colleagues on the Conservative side, I think we've been able to bring a great deal more attention to that issue, and our leaders announced a policy to work to build a national energy corridor to facilitate transportation of energy resources across the country, a nation-building project for the 21st century that builds on the legacy of Conservative prime ministers building things like the railroad in the 19th century. So I think that's a proposal. That's not something that's done, but it's a proposal that hopefully we'll be able to see the realization of after the next election. And one project I spent a lot of time working on recently is around international organ harvesting and trafficking. In China, we know, and it was Canadians that did a lot of the initial research on this, about how political prisoners are killed and have their organs harvested for transplantation. But there are also instances in other countries where the poor, the disadvantaged may be exploited and have their organs taken either against their will or sort of through economic coercion. And some of that is driven by demand for organs from the developed world. So I have put forward legislation to make it a criminal offense for a Canadian to go abroad to receive an organ for which there hasn't been consent. It's a different way of thinking about law in the sense that it involves extraterritorial application of our law. Most Canadian law applies to what happens within Canada, but this, recognizing the way in which the actions of Canadians may drive demand for these organs and therefore exploitation and human rights abuses, that we have a role in trying to address the actions that Canadians may be involved in abroad. Now that bill is almost done. It hasn't passed yet. It's kind of in the final stages in the Senate. I proposed a bill in the House. A similar bill was proposed by Senator Salma Tulajan in the Senate. Her bill, just because of some process issues with the Senate, was able to move forward more quickly and come to the House. We passed it with some amendments. Now it's back in the Senate. So
wow,
I'm hopeful that'll make it through.
Well, you're a trailblazer. You're bringing up changes that much needed changes, things people don't talk about. We have to talk more about them. But before that, it's time for a short break. Welcome back to Spotlight. We are talking to the Honorable MP, Garnett Genuis. So this is great. I love the fact that the issues that you focus on are just not your riding, it's also international affairs. And that kind of speaks to what Canada is all about, the multiculturalism. So people coming from abroad also, bring issues that is part of their country that kind of becomes part of our country as well. So at this point, I would like you to just elaborate a little bit more on what you talked about earlier about how you focus on the immigrant issue.
Yeah, it's a great point you make, the way in which people, when they come to Canada, they bring aspects of their experience. They bring an awareness of things happening abroad. Sometimes the use of terminology like diaspora politics is associated with a negative, but I actually think we have a real strength as a country. The connections that we have at a people-to-people level with other countries, how that can inform our ability to promote justice in the world, but also to promote our own interests, our foreign affairs engagement, our prioritization of human rights. This is good for Canada. There's a connection between the interests of Canadians, of Canadian businesses, and our thoughtful engagement abroad, and a lot of that thoughtful engagement can be facilitated by those people-to-people connections. So, you asked about the immigration piece, and this is, I think, going to be an important issue in the next election, how we think about Canada's immigration system, and certainly something that I'm talking to a lot of people about, people in cultural communities and all Canadians. And now our party, the Conservative Party, is very pro-immigration. And in order to sustain support for immigration, we need to fix the problems in the system. It comes down to management, to managing it well, which means strengthening the private sponsorship channel. It means helping to connect our economic needs with those who can come to fill those economic needs. Our leader spoke this week about credential recognition, that people sometimes come to Canada qualified based on certain qualifications that they have, but then they're not actually able to use those qualifications when they come to Canada. I think we need to review the situation around international students. A lot of discussion about that, about how to make sure that people have opportunity. They're not exploited when they come as international students, and closing the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement that is allowing this dramatic growth in illegal immigration with all the costs that are associated with it. So, I think we can do better on immigration, which will restore and increase public confidence in the system and in the contribution that well-managed immigration can make to Canada.
Well said. So now if we go along the same lines, so we are talking about people coming into our country and how we are going to help them transition better with everything that you have in mind. But if we now take it further out, like as you already enlightened us as you're working on international affairs, persecuted religious minorities, that is also a group that you're interested in and issues associated with them. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So I think Canada can lead in a major way on a global level on behalf of those vulnerable minorities who are facing persecution. Why does Canada have a special role in this? Well, we have a strong domestic experience of pluralism. We're not perfect, but we seek to reconcile our differences in a way that affirms universal, immutable human dignity, that gives people the freedom to practice their faith. And we also have a federal structure which seeks to reconcile the interests and concerns of different regions of the country through strong provincial and local government. These are things that we don't see in many parts of the world. We see kind of strong majoritarian tendencies, the idea that minorities don't have the rights to full or equal citizenship. And these are things that we can challenge from our own experience of showing, hey, this can work. We can build a strong country based on civic nationalism. And we make the distinction between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism is something we reject, the idea that societies should be organized on the basis of a common ethnicity. No, we say societies require unity. They require collaboration. We can't just be a whole bunch of little islands. We have to have a common society. But what brings us together is not ethnicity, language, or religion, but it's shared civic values. And that's a model that works very well, and it's a model that works elsewhere. Also, I mean, we can promote these ideas in a special way as Canada because we don't have a colonial history beyond our borders. We don't have the baggage that comes with being a superpower. We're seen as, in the positive sense, disinterested. Our engagement isn't perceived perceived as purely about kind of advancing our own self-interest, but rather genuinely reflective of good intentions and our values. So this means that Canada can lead in this area, and in the past we have seen that leadership. So we used to have, under the Conservative government, something called the Office of Religious Freedom, and it was a relatively small office, and one that I would like to see built on, and we can build on that model. But it was led by an ambassador for religious freedom, who was at the time Andrew Bennett, and the office was a mechanism for speaking publicly about religious freedom issues, for educating the bureaucracy, for making sure our own government was aware of and incorporating these issues into their advocacy. But a lot of the office's budget was spent on programs directly on the ground in other countries. It had a program in Pakistan, it had a program in Sri Lanka, it had a program in the kind of Jos area of Nigeria. And some of the programs were actually not publicly disclosed because they were working in countries that were so sensitive that the work would be jeopardized by talking about it, which should underline, the importance and the sensitivity, but also the value of the work being done. Unfortunately, that office was canceled by the Liberal government, and I think sometimes the problem with the Liberal government is not appreciating, let's say, the importance of the types of dynamics, majority, minority, but also how religious differences can shape conflicts, and how promoting pluralism in a robust way is necessary. So these are arguments that we made at the time and will continue to make, and hopefully we'll be able to restore that office and restore that Canadian leadership in this area.
Very well said. And we have to focus a little bit more on one of the communities which we have a lot of viewers from. So we'll get to that, but before that, it's time for a short break. Welcome back to Spotlight. We are talking to the Honourable MP, Garnett Genuis. So this is great. You enlightened us about what your goals are for the minorities. Let's now focus on the Sikh community. A recent report did come about, talking about what's important in that community. Can you enlighten us more?
Sure, yeah. So I've had the pleasure of getting to know the Sikh community quite a bit over my time as a parliamentarian, and my interest in human rights advocacy has brought me together with many people in the Sikh community. The Sikh community has a strong human rights orientation that goes right back to the founding values that animated the faith's origin, and in particular the emphasis on universal human equality as kind of a counter to some of the prevailing caste practices of the time. Now that we have a strong, vibrant Sikh community in Canada, and various issues that I've worked with the community on. One is the issue of Sikhs and Hindus in Afghanistan that face serious persecution. I've been regularly tabling petitions along with some of my colleagues to encourage the government to do more to allow the direct private sponsorship of vulnerable minorities, the Sikh and Hindu community from Afghanistan, to come directly to Canada. The community here is ready to sponsor people, but there is a requirement for the immigration minister to put in place a special program if that direct sponsorship is going to happen. As it is, there's some people that have fled Afghanistan to India who are then able to come, but that's a minority of the overall community. And I know we were talking before about the issue of the terrorism report, which is a report that the government put out, which suggested that there was a problem of terrorism within, or of kind of violent extremism within the community. And this is something that a lot of people raise concerns about, in that look, I don't have access to the intelligence that may or may not have informed those claims, but there was virtually no explanation or support in the report itself. It referred to events that happened decades ago. And I asked the government an order paper question, trying to get more information. And the order paper question said that there is evidence of involvement in terrorist financing. But I looked up the records in terms of charges that have been laid, and as far as I can tell, no charges have been laid at all related to so-called Khalistani movements involving terrorist financing. Since those provisions of the act were put forward. So I think what people in the community were asking is, okay, if there's an issue here, you need to work with the community and you need to provide evidence and support. And the government made some subsequent language changes to kind of how those things are described. And the language changes were an improvement. But I think it's still important to note that there hasn't yet been an explanation about, where the government is even coming from, and the other issue is, unfortunately, the government, in the context of changing that language, they made other language changes. So there's a point in the report where it refers to the role of Iran in Canada. It refers to Hezbollah as Iran-backed, and that reference to Iranian support for Hezbollah was removed from the report as well. And that certainly wasn't a change that any community was asking for. So it raises questions about what the government was doing there. So this is an important issue for the community, but also discussions around human rights issues in general for this community, religious accommodation. I had a good meeting with some people yesterday about, and as part of that, discussing the issue of federal work sites, people driving into the Port of Vancouver, and the issues around religious accommodation of the turbines. So a lot of good issues, and certainly appreciate the role the Sikh community plays in Canada and the value of partnership and moving these issues forward.
Wow, lots of issues, and I'm so glad that you're getting involved in everything that's important, not just for your own riding, but anything that can affect your riding, the community, which also takes it internationally. It's been a pleasure talking to you today, Garnett. Thank you so much for enlightening us about all the issues, some which we were not even aware of, like you said, that needs to be brought to the front. And we are so glad as a community leader you're doing that and helping the community out. We would like to wish you all the best with everything that you're doing, and we would support you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be on the show today, and all the best to your listeners.
Thank you very much. So that was Honourable MP Garnett Genuis, who has enlightened us on issues that we need to be aware of within our community. Well, that's a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for watching us. Continue to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and write to us at spotlight@ethnicchannels.com. Until next week, this is Amitha signing off, encouraging you to support our government leaders.